Please welcome the directors of A Place at the Table, Laurie Silverbush and Christy Jacobson. Yeah. And our special guest, Professor Jacob Seidel. Let's start with the makers. How do you two beautiful, well-nourished women come across a problem like this?
I could start.
Yeah.
I had directed a fiction film about young women who are incarcerated in jail. To research the film, I spent a lot of time with young women who were in jail, and I discovered that every one of them had known hunger or had been without enough food growing up, and that was very interesting to me. And then I was mentoring a girl whose family went hungry. I helped her get into a special school. She had a lot of learning problems. And this was a special school with great educators, and I felt so good about myself that I got her into this special school. And then I got a call from the principal of her school saying that she was foraging in the trash for food. It was not a school that provided free breakfast or lunch. It was not a public school. And it was very shocking, very upsetting. That was my sort of personal introduction to the idea. But I had a fiction background, so I reached out to my colleague, Christy, who has a terrific background in documentaries, and I asked her if she thought there was a documentary in that, and she can probably...
And you did see one.
And I mean, when Laurie approached me, I was intrigued, as many of you may be, enough to come to the theater today, but didn't know a lot about it. And I think, you know, as a documentary filmmaker, you know, in many ways your subjects choose you. And once I started digging and we started researching and I started to understand how pervasive it is right there in the United States where I live, how insidious it is, it just felt like a story I couldn't not tell. And that was only reinforced when we started meeting people across the country who were experiencing this, and just the sort of deeply personal nature of it continued to draw me, and here we are now.
Professor Seidel, welcome that you're here. You teach about food and the consequences and the social aspects of everything. Is this a very American problem?
No, it's actually a global problem. It used to be a typical rich country kind of problem, where there's, and actually that's only over the last 50 years or so. Invariably, if you look at poorer countries and also pre-19th century US and Europe, the more affluent people would be the most obese and would have the most affluent diseases like diabetes and heart disease. You wouldn't find that among poor people. But that has switched around, and now it's almost a universal problem. Even in the urban slums of Delhi and in Mexico City and in Cairo, you know, where most of the people live in suburban slums now, and will be living more of them, will be living in those situations, where there is actually very poor food quality and welfare diseases, what we call them. Affluent diseases, but they are really poverty-related diseases.
They got transferred to the lower classes?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
And there's also, somebody says in the film, obesity is a neighbor to hunger. Is that something we see in our country, in Holland as well?
Absolutely, yes. The inverse association between social class, income, and education and obesity has been here since we've started studying it in the 1970s or so. And it's been widening all the time. So we see a lot of hunger, and in the food bank programs that we study, for instance, in the Netherlands, most of the people who come there are actually overweight or obese, and to a much higher degree than the general population. So yes, we do find this at exactly the same rate here.
Wow.
Only the differences and the inequalities are steeper in the US than here.
Okay. Is there a question from the audience? I'm sure there is. Let's start here. Oh.
I'm kind of curious in terms of solutions. Obviously, it's a big issue, but the big agribusiness are also major contributors to campaigns. And so, I mean, I definitely agree that one of the things that we need to do in the U.S. is kind of change the people who are in charge and vote them out. But how do we do that when the big chemical companies are also the biggest contributors to campaigns? It seems
You mean
like
the
that's
lobbyists
kind of
as well?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
seems like that's kind of a complex issue, and I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit more about
Who
that.
can say something about that?
I mean, you make a very good point. And, you know, on the one hand, it's clearly, you know, challenging times in America and politically speaking. I mean, I do believe, for better or for worse, that, you know, that change is possible, that if we hold our politicians accountable, you know, on that issue specifically and this issue, you know, there is the possibility for change. And, you know, there are, you know, clearly only a handful of politicians, one of whom is featured in this film, who specifically care about this issue. But something that we learned in the making of the film is, you know, we as Americans at this particular moment in time, I think, feel somewhat helpless. But Representative McGovern, you know, told us it's oftentimes that, you know, moments before a vote, you know, if he's heard this from other people, you know, if you get 6, 8 calls on an issue, it makes you realize this matters. And so I think that we need to just step up. You know, we were inspired a lot by the 1968 film that you saw. These are different times, so of course they require different types of action. And our film is ultimately going to, is right now in the throes of working with a number of organizations that are, with Participant Media, our producing partner, creating an enormous campaign. So I'm hopeful about that. I don't know if you want to answer more specifically. Yeah.
And Michelle Obama, she's currently very big on feeding children in America. Couldn't you get her involved in the film?
Do you want to take a chance? Okay.
I think it's a good question. It's a little complicated, the answer. Up until very recently, as everybody in this room knows, the administration was very involved in re-election. That was their primary focus. In President Obama's first 4 years, I think he had to an extent, distance himself from issues pertaining to poverty because there was such a right-wing component voice that fighting him in Congress, and they were very eager to paint him as the food stamp president or the urban black, you know, just really trying to make him seem as if he was speaking only to a narrow interest. As we're trying to show with the film that actually feeding everybody and poverty, the larger issue, speaks to a very broad interest. To fix this is actually in everyone's best interest. So as Christy mentioned, we are working with Participant Media as a film company that's really quite adept at building social action campaigns that are broad-based, that are grassroots. And one of the things we would like to do, and we have access to Michelle Obama through a number of channels, and mostly through the family's private chef, Sam Cass, has also become the person who's helped them design their entire healthy eating anti-obesity initiative. He was responsible he's the architect of her Let's Move campaign. The campaign that Michelle Obama's been doing has been specifically focusing on childhood obesity, but more from an exercise. Let's Move is the name of it, not let's eat better or let's make sure healthy food can get in the hands of everyone. So she's had her hands tied a little because she can't necessarily say eat less meat without angering an entire industry, or eat low fat or whatever, or eat, you know. That said, I see that it seems to us that in the next 4 years, they're going to be able to really broaden that. And the campaign that Christy was speaking about is one that's going to empower people who see the film to contact their local representatives, their state representatives, and even their members of Congress to say, we're paying attention to how you vote on specific initiatives that affect hunger. And one of the things that's already come from the film is one of the people you meet in the film is Ken Cook, who is the president of something called the Environmental Working Group. They have formed a food policy scorecard made up of a number of individuals who are similar academics like what you do, Jakob, and also people who are in a position to evaluate the legislation that's in front of Congress and then assign each legislator a score based on how well they're voting on these issues and making it public through Twitter and Facebook and all different types of social media so that average Americans will know how their representatives are voting and can say, well, now we know this piece of legislation's ahead of you. We want you to vote like this or like that. And that transparency has to filter upward, up through the administration. They also have, we formed a council of about 5 or 6 of the people who are most at the forefront of this issue, and they've drafted a letter to President Obama, which I believe goes to him next week, asking him to renew his commitment to ending childhood hunger and laying out a pathway, including a meeting at the White House and a national conference on hunger, which hasn't happened since Nixon's time, to make global news out of it and push it to the front of the legislative agenda.
Another question of the audience. Over there. Yes, you.
I'm just curious about how you came across the people you included in the film. Fantastic film, by the way. Really touching. But,
How did you meet and find your subjects in the
Yeah,
film?
how long did it take to find them?
How long did it take to find them?
Yeah.
Do you want to answer that?
Thank you. So it was, the process of making the film was about a 3-year process, and it started with reading an article about Dr. Mariana Chilton, the founder of Witnesses to Hunger, very early in our research, and through her we got invited. Lori and I went out and met with her, and were really inspired by her and what she was doing with that organization. And we started attending the Witnesses to Hunger meetings and meeting all of the women, including Barbie. And once we started filming with Barbie, she obviously just struck us and continues to amaze us to this day. And so, of course, that was an urban story, and we knew through our research that this problem was happening in every single community across the country, and we wanted the film to open people's eyes up to realizing that it's happening in places where you don't necessarily expect it. Shortly after we got the word that we were going to be getting funding and working with Participant Media, and therefore could get out of the office. Actually, our cinematographer, Kirsten Johnson, who is here in the audience with us, and I got on a plane and went to Denver because there was an event happening, shortly after we knew we could, get out of the office a little bit more than just Philly. And through a colleague there, we heard about this pastor in this community about 4 hours west of Denver. And once we met Pastor Bob, we started to meet the other people in that community, of which just about everybody was affected. And we too were incredibly affected by our very first night at Pastor Bob's Wednesday night meal. And over time, spending a number of trips in that community, we ultimately met Rosie and her family. And then to the Delta, do you want to take that? Okay, and then to the Delta.
So paradoxically, given the numbers of obese Americans, that was probably our hardest story to find. A number of factors. For one thing, we kind of have a culture of blame around obesity. So people who are obese are often led to feel it's their fault, bad lifestyle choices, laziness. We rarely sort of give them credit for doing the best they can in a system it's a little bit rigged against them. So we had a hard time, and we knew we wanted to go down to the Mississippi Delta because that had been the locus of the Physicians Task Force on Hunger some 40-odd years ago, back when the first film was being made. That was in some ways an offshoot of a group of physicians that had gone traveling with Robert Kennedy through the Deep South and exposing poverty in America, and it had culminated in that film. And in a way, we wanted to go back there and say, okay, 40 years later, how are we doing? You know, and we found that in that same place, it was simultaneously the hungriest, the area with the worst malnutrition, and also the area with the most obesity. And we eventually found, a school that was doing really good things to try to change the food on the trays for the kids, and simultaneously working in terms of the education the kids were getting. Because you often hear people say, well, if you gave it to the kids, they wouldn't want it. But as Odessa
You need
Cherry,
to tell
the
people what
teacher,
they eat.
yes, and if you see the response she gets from the children in her classroom, they're very excited and they find it delicious. So we were very inspired by that, and we met Shermanica and her mother on one of those trips.
Would it be possible, Professor, to make a film in Holland like this? And would there be a necessity to do that?
Yeah, I think so, because we have the same kind of prejudices that you have in the US about lack of willpower and about individual responsibility for lifestyles, and it's all a matter of choice. And we know it's not true. Yeah. And there are very simple illustrations of that. We've done a lot of in the low-grader schools in the more poorer areas in the bigger cities in the Netherlands. And in none of the schools, you could actually drink water. But in all of them, you could buy sodas and, So there is no choice. Actually, there's no choice that really matters. There's a choice of lots of beverages, but there's the real choice is really absolute.
Sugar.
Yeah, sugar and maybe sweeteners. Yeah. But that's really, it's really about the environment, the food environment, which makes a lot of the different choices. We make about 40 different food choices every day, and 80% of them are all made involuntarily. I mean, you don't do it automatically, and you do them based on what's around you. And then on top of that, we know that if people are under, and you didn't talk about that much, but under subordinate stress, you have no control over your life. And these studies have been done in monkeys. Then monkeys make poorer choices and become more obese, and they get heart disease and diabetes. It's stress on top of poor environments. And so the people keep asking for the poorer choices as well. We've seen this in our food bank studies, in which people actually, if you take out the crisp and you put in more vegetables, then people start complaining about the lack of crisps. This is what they feel they are entitled to, and it's something they really want because it's a treat. And it has all to do about the cultural value of food and how people are related to this. I mean, if you have a government program that would force everybody here to eat radishes or in schools, then most of them would throw it away and would be disgusted or wouldn't like it. But if you have a school garden project, we do studies on this, and have children to raise and grow their radishes, there's nothing more delicious than that. So it's having a contact with your food and where it comes from.
So take children to a farm, that's what you said before.
Take children to a farm, have school gardens. They won't, solve the food problem, but they will give you another connection.
The awareness that people were talking about, that's the beginning.
Yeah, we saw in the film lots of houses with gardens in which they could grow stuff if they would have time, and if they
seeds.
would have the skills, and if they would have the seeds. But it wouldn't solve this. But we know that actually urban agriculture is not a solution, but it's somehow the buffer between hunger and all of these diseases.
Another question, yes, over here.
Could you say a few words about the food quality of food banks in the Netherlands today?
Sure. Can you say a little bit about the quality in the food banks in Holland?
Yeah, it's the same as everywhere. It's based on what's being on offer. And so most of the fruits and vegetables are actually behind sell date. Is that, they're perishable products, and they don't look attractive. They look a bit sloppy and soft. And then most of the other stuff is actually the non-perishable foods, which are very, very popular because you can store them and you can stock them, and you can do all kinds of things with them, and they're usually donated. I once went to a Connecticut food bank. Well, it's actually a storage room, I guess. Most of the foods were donated by PepsiCo, which was actually in the neighborhood.
Did they do that on purpose?
Yeah, well, it's yes and no. Yeah. I mean, it's trying to get people to like your brands, obviously, but also to do a good thing. I'm sure there are sort of multiple intentions behind this. But actually, it is something which people favor much more, because you can actually store this and keep it, and most of the fresh products are actually perishable. So we do see actually now that in the Netherlands, where there's actually not much donated to food banks, and the demand on food banks is rapidly increasing. It's tripled during the last 5 years or so. It's way below any standard in the US, but it's still there, and it's growing rapidly. And there also then the number of food items that you can provide that are healthy are actually dwindling and are not so attractive. So the food quality of the food banks is dependent on who gives the food to the food banks.
I just want to speak to that, because since you mentioned you went to a food bank in Connecticut. Right. Most of the food that's donated to food banks and from food banks into local food pantries in the U.S. Is extra food that the big corporations, a PepsiCo, for example, or a ConAgra or Kraft Foods, they produce well in abundance, well above what they can sell. And although you would think that that's bad business, in this case, it's actually very profitable for them to do that, because the ingredients that go into the heavily processed foods are highly subsidized, as you saw in the film, which makes them very, very cheap to produce. So the typical laws of supply and demand don't apply. They can then overproduce without real financial consequence, and then turn around and donate that food and get a tax write-off for it. Because studies have shown that when a big corporation has to dispose of their extra food, so disposal fees are expensive, they would much rather give it to a food bank, get a big tax write-off, and quite frankly get something that Janet Poppendick, one of our experts in the film, calls the halo effect. So they look like really good guys, and they get big campaigns around all the good work they do. But they've shown that if the tax write-off is not greater than the cost of disposing, they'll just dispose of the food. So I find that personally a little enraging. Only I'm all for charity. I think it's a very good thing. But when charity is actually a front for some other motive, it kind of makes me nuts, and it gives the population this false idea that charity is great. It's what takes care of it. And all the food that gets given out in the U.S. and all of this food banking and all of the charity, the problem's still growing and only getting worse. So I feel like we have to take a step back from food banks and from food pantries and say, how do we fix this systemic problem? And let these be an emergency solution for hurricanes and natural disasters and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Final
because
reaction.
it's chronically, and it's chronic aid in the sense, but also which is important that if children grow up on fatty and sugary foods, they become habituated, you could even say addicted to this. I mean, it's a sort of lifelong cycle. They would always keep preferring the poorer foods. And this is, I think, an under-neglected problem. That's also part of this, because if they would have enough money and have a job, then they would still buy the junk food, because they're so used to it, accustomed to it.
Yeah, you can add.
Yeah. I think that is one of, I think, the most important. You were talking about solutions and the frustrations and the politics, but the reason why it was so important to us and we were so happy when we met Miss Cherry and we filmed that scene with the honeydew is that education at the youngest age is an essential part of solving the problem, at least in America, and it sounds like here too. Yeah.
A final short question about the film. Yes.
I'm curious about that you're also showing a lot of focus on the schools and the lunches at schools in America. As far as I know, in Holland, we do not deliver lunch by schools, but we as parents give food to our children. And I was actually wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, compared to the situation in the US, we give our children here food as a lunch at school. And what's your opinion about that? Would that make a difference?
Sorry, so food is not provided by school?
No, not
Parents
at all.
have
Send the food from home.
just the food from home?
Yeah.
I mean, I think if everybody has food at home to bring to school, then
Yeah,
that works. But we know that's not the case. You know, in free when, you know, in the 1940s when we established the National School Lunch Program in the U.S., it was as a result of people going into the draft and being malnourished, and the government said this is not okay, we've got to do something about it. And I feel that that's an important role for the government to play. And we also know that when we started serving free school breakfast in the schools, it vastly improved kids' you know, ability to stay focused and learn. So it seems to be an important piece of what's happening in America.
Well, in the Netherlands, at least in Amsterdam, in the more deprived areas, 1 in 3 children or more don't get go to school without having any breakfast. And the things they bring to school are actually quite appalling. They are usually also sugary drinks, the cheapest kinds, and the cheapest sort of cookies and things like that. So actually we've done with the GGD in Amsterdam some project on healthy eating in schools, and actually that improves the situation quite a bit. But then there's always the reluctance, how is going, you know, the state is going to take over the parenting role or the responsibility and things like that. So it always becomes a sort of ethical discussion. But I'm sure there's actually quite a lot of improvement, especially now with schools that are 9 to 5 and they have this, you know, break in the middle where they have to do something. And actually cooking and having foods provided by local farmers, which were some of the projects, actually serves a lot of purposes. It increases the attendance at school, it has parental participation in schools, it actually makes the appreciation of foods better, and there's more structure, so everybody wins in a sense. But there is this reluctance also in the Netherlands to make that step and make it mandatory.
I'm sure there are a lot more questions, but we do have to wrap up here. Please go to the Festival Center, maybe you will be there, to answer the rest of your questions. Thank you very much, Professor Jacob Seidel, Laura Silverbush, and Christy Jacobson.